Hello. I'm going to be analysing a poem today to try and establish the identity of Arthur Machen. Not this Arthur Machen, the author of mystic novels in the late 19th and early 20th century. That's who comes up if you Google it. But the name is just a coincidence, and he isn't connected with this at all. What I'm talking about is a fleeting reference to Arthur Machen in a 16th century Welsh poetic work attributed to Dafydd Benwyn. Despite my interest in the Arthurian legend, I was completely unaware of this reference until recently, when I came across it while rereading a portion of Artorius Rex Discovered. It's used as a source by authors Wilson and Blackett as evidence to support their identification of Athrys ap Meurig as the real historical King Arthur. This is what Wilson and Blackett have said. Nearer our own times, the last of the true bards was Dafydd Benwyn. Dafydd Benwyn's knowledge of Welsh history was encyclopedic, in common with the other bards. Over 330 closely written pages of his work survive, and these contain many poems directed towards his patrons and extolling them and their illustrious ancestors. He constantly names great numbers of the ancient princes of the area and brings in the ancestral kings in the correct context. Amongst the many often used names of these ancestors of the Morgans, the lords of Gwent, is of course the mighty Arthur. Now Dafydd Benwyn names Arthur as Arthur Machen, and everyone living in South Wales knows exactly where Machen is, the location of Machen in what we elsewhere identify as the ancient area of Cernyw, and Arthur described as Arthur Machen. Now this is a very interesting interpretation. If I'm reading this right, the claim is that the historical Arthur is mentioned in a poem by Dafydd Benwyn as an ancestor of the noble Morgan family, a family described by Wilson and Blackett as the Lords of Gwent. It's implied too that Arthur went by the name Arthur Machen, using the cognomen Machen because of its association with the area of South East Wales. A couple of other things to explain quickly before we move on. If you don't know anything about Wilson and Blackett, you may be a bit confused by the reference to Cernyw as being in South Wales. I've covered this in quite a bit more detail previously in the latter part of my video on Breuddwyd Rhonabwy. Essentially, they suggest that Cernyw was the old name for South East Wales, and it is this Cernyw that is believed to be at the root of Arthur's association with Cornwall. A bit of a mix-up as Cernyw in Welsh today is Cornwall, and there are several mentions of this place in relation to Arthur in early Welsh sources. Check out my other video on that for a bit more detail. And all of this feeds into Wilson and Blackett's wider theory that the Arthur of legend can be identified with the real historical ruler of Gwent, known as Athrys ap Meurig. They weren't the first to suggest this connection. It goes back at least as early as the first part of the 18th century by Thomas Cart, and subsequently also endorsed by David Jones, Siola Morgannwg, William Owen Pugh, Morian, and others, all credible historians and antiquarians in their day, but not with the best of reputations now. The Athrys connection is also not as popular now as it once was. It's sometimes referred to as the Silurian Arthur theory, and judging by what I see online, opinions seem quite polarised on it, but mostly against it. It doesn't get much scholarly attention either. Nevertheless, several modern authors do still support the identification of Arthur with Athrys. For those who don't know where Machen is, by the way, here's a map. It's a village in the historic county of Gwent, South East Wales, and there's a long association between this area and the Morgan family. That's the family described by Wilson and Blackett as the Lords of Gwent. The Morgans certainly were a powerful family at the time of Dafydd Benwyn in the late Tudor era. They held several royal patronages and lived at these fine houses. This is Tredegar House, with its origins in the Tudor era, and Plas Machen, a Tudor manor which, according to Corflaen, was built by Morgan of Machen, who led the men of Gwent at Bosworth in 1485. Bosworth is really significant to all of this. Like many other Welsh noble houses, the Morgans had really gained royal favour following the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, when Henry Tudor, thereafter Henry VII, had usurped the English throne from the Yorkist Richard III. Several of the Morgans were known to have been in Henry's army that day, the best known being Sir John Morgan, sometimes known as a Marchog Tew, an early ally of Henry who was then well rewarded by the king, including the royal offices of Sheriff of Wentlug and Newport and Steward of the Machen Commort. once again an explicit Machen reference to this family. Another Morgan ancestor allied with Henry was Sir Morgan John, knighted at the Battle of Blackheath in 1497, where Henry VII defeated the Cornish rebellion, so no Brythonic solidarity on that one obviously. Another was Thomas Morgan, Sir John's second son, esquire to the body of Henry VII. The royal favour that the Morgans had gained was then inherited by John Morgan's descendants, who became the patrons of the bard David Benwyn and the subject of a lot of his poetry. Several other Welsh allies were greatly rewarded by Henry, of course. The best known was Rhys ap Thomas. His early support for Henry was crucial, and Rhys was actually credited with delivering the death blow to Richard III in some accounts. Okay, the Battle of Bosworth and the subsequent ascent of the Tudor dynasty was the key event that really brought the Welsh nobles into the sphere of the English crown. Henry's appeal is often explained as an expression of romantic Welsh patriotism. Henry, who was of partial Welsh descent and supposedly flew with Rhai Goch in battle, was even heralded by some as a Mab Darogan, a prophesied messianic type hero and saviour of the Britons. But a more likely motivation was that these Welsh nobles were just trying to advance their own social standing. There was the prospect of earning royal patronage for themselves to elevate their own status and that of their family, as is what happened with the Morgans. Okay, I've gone on a bit now about this period in history, but the poem in question does make reference to these Tudor era figures, so it's important to get a background on this. But some earlier ancestors of the Morgans are clearly referenced in the poetry too. The family traced their lineage back to the noble and royal houses of both southeast and southwest Wales. There's a good book on this written by a Morgan descendant, Appleton Morgan, of the 27th generation of Cadifwr Fawr, Cadifwr Fawr being the earliest claimed ancestor of the family. Other notable names in this lineage, as recorded here, are Llywelyn ap Ifor of Tredegar, Lord of St Clair, married Angharad, daughter of Sir Morgan ap Meredydd, from the Welsh lords of Caerleon. One son of Llywelyn ap Ifor was Ifor Hael, whence Morgan of Gwern y Clepa. He is notable as the chief patron of Wales's best-known poet, Dafydd ap Gwilym. So these ancestors lived during the Norman lordship of Glamorgan, a really turbulent time for the Welsh nobility of the area. Norman incursions from England began in the late 11th century, and the last native king of Glamorgan, Iestyn ap Gwrgant, was killed in 1093. The Normans then established the Marcher lordship of Glamorgan, a largely autonomous fiefdom for the lord who was the ultimate authority in the territory and not really beholden to the English crown. Robert FitzHamon established the lordship of Glamorgan in 1093. In 1217 it then passed to Gilbert de Clare, and the de Clares ruled it then till 1337. The lords of Glamorgan ruled their territory sicut regal, as Gilbert de Clare put it, like a king. But the invading Normans didn't have it all their own way in these territories. They were continually challenged by many of the native Welsh descendants of the ruling families that they had conquered, who had clung on to some territory within what the Normans called the lordship of Glamorgan. Many of the native Welsh lords didn't recognise Norman overlordship and lived essentially autonomous from Norman rule, and were often actively hostile towards it. The Marcher lordships were only formally abolished by the laws in Wales Acts 1536, where Wales was essentially annexed by England, forming a single state and legal jurisdiction under the English crown. But as I said, much of the Welsh nobility had already become very close to the English crown before this, especially since 1485. I've just noticed in Appleton Morgan's book that although he doesn't really cover the early medieval period, he has something to say about Arthur. King Arthur, a legendary king of Britain, but not improbably the adumbration of a real local king or chieftain therein, is said, after a defeat in some one of his battles with another local potentate, to have removed his queen for safety to the coast of what is now Glamorganshire, and her child, Arthur's younger son, there born, was called Morgan, the man born by the sea, whence Glamorgan, the country of the man born by the sea. Now we know from the pedigrees of Glamorgan that Athrois ap Meirig also lived in this area and had a son called Morgan. So I think that Appleton Morgan is probably alluding to this belief. We can probably put him down as one of the Silurian Arthurists. Okay, so let's have a look at David Benwyn now. Remember, the Wilson and Blackhead said that this poet describes Arthur as Arthur Machen and as an ancestor of the Morgans. So who was this poet? Hardly a household name today, even to those with a wider interest in Welsh literature, but he does seem to have been well known in his own day. He was a native of Glamorgan, from the village of Llangaenor, who flourished as a bard in the late 16th century. The Bywgraffiadur describes him as the most prolific of the bards of Glamorgan, who sang the praises of most of the landed families of Glamorgan and Monmouthshire, and inherited the lore of the older chief bards, known as the Pencaerwyddiaid, such as Richard Iorwerth and possibly Lewis Morgannwg. It also says that his poetry is important for two reasons. In the first place, they contain the genealogies of many of the families of Glamorgan and Monmouthshire. In the second place, they give us the Welsh forms of place names in those regions. Good to know then that Benwyn's poetry is recognised as a valuable source for the ancestry of the noble families of South East Wales. This article in the Bywgraffiadur was written by G.J. Williams, by the way, who came up in my last video on Iolo Morgannwg. It could be something to Wilson and Blackett's suggestion then. A note of caution though. It seems to me that 16th century Welsh poetry hasn't really been used by other authors as evidence for the historical Arthur. Anything actually that post-dates Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae is considered quite dubious, and likely influenced by Geoffrey's wildly popular but mostly unhistorical version of Arthur as a European conqueror and a paragon of chivalry. Some references in earlier Welsh poetry, on the other hand, are often used as source material. I talked about one in passing recently, of course, a poem called Geraint Fil Erbyn, the oldest version of which is preserved in the Black Book of Carmarthen from around 1250, but believed to be copied from a much older source. Arthur was mentioned as participating in the Battle of Llongborth, in a poem with some characteristics of Old Welsh. Other fleeting and ambiguous references could be in the Gododdin and Marwnad Cynddylan. Arthur then features more prominently in poems like Preiddianwfn and Pal Gwrw y Porthawr, but these seem to be more mythical in nature. Viewers of this channel may remember my recent video on the Llyn Fawr Hoard, where I talked about Arthur's mythical association with the cauldron. These sources have the benefit of being closer to Arthur's own time, but in reality give little away about Arthur. But let's put that aside for now and try and find the David Benwyn reference in question. There's no exact reference by Wilson and Blackett, so we do have to do a bit of digging. An edition of the poet's work was edited by J. Curl Fletcher and published in 1909, a selection from the works of David Benwyn, the Tudor Bard of the Morgans of Tredegar. I suspect that Wilson and Blackett probably used this edition too. It's available to read for free online on archive.org. There's a great introduction that says a similar sort of thing to what was said in the Bywgraffiadur, but with some more historical context of his work and its themes and subjects. I've got to read this out because it gives us an insight into the Morgan family and the relationship with David Benwyn, and another very well-known Welsh bard too. So J. Curl Fletcher says, in the 14th century, the Morgans of Gwent fostered and trained the great Welsh genius of that age. The cultured home of Ifor Hael, the Lord of Maes Aleg, sheltered the poet of nature Dafydd ap Gwilym, who in his glorious verse immortalised his patron, who he himself has styled Ifor Hael. In the 16th century, under totally different circumstances, the old hospitable home of the Morgans harboured another type of poet, for David Benwyn sings a far different song to the wild, free lays of Ab Gwilym. The earlier poet lived in an age when Wales was self-centred, when men still dreamt of a free Wales, whereas in Benwyn's days Wales and England were bound together by those bonds of common interest and loyalty which time has only strengthened. That last sentence there is a really romantic pro-monarchy view of the relationship between Wales and the English crown post-1485. I can't imagine it being endorsed by everyone, but the ties between the Welsh nobility and the English crown were very beneficial for many of the Welsh noble houses, but often at the expense of their Welshness. But the thrust of what J. Curl Fletcher is saying is to equate the relationship between the Morgans and their bard David Benwyn to that of their ancestor Ifor Hael and his bard Dafydd ap Gwilym. It praises the Morgans as generous patrons, essentially. It's the archetypal relationship between patron and bard, and the loss of this sort of patronage after the time of David Benwyn was greatly lamented in later periods. J. Kerr Fletcher has also made some interesting comments about the manuscript source of the poetry. According to him, the manuscript book was written early in the 17th century, possibly by Llywelyn Sion of Llangewydd, and has been in the possession of the Llywelyns of Baglan for 3 or 4 generations. Unfortunately, portions of some of the pages have in the course of time got torn away, thus leaving slight gaps in some of the lines. Okay, so the manuscript is defective in places and must have been copied from an earlier source too, so we do have to keep that in mind. Kerr Fletcher also gives his thoughts on the significance of David Benwyn's poetry. He calls him the last of the great bards, who reflects the magnificence of the Tudor age. He also says that the historic value of Benwyn's work consists in his remarkable knowledge of the history and genealogy of the families of South Wales. In this, too, he had a purpose, for he was thus able to inspire the young cadets of the houses of Morgan and Herbert by reciting the splendid deeds of their sires, and to remind them of the blood which flowed in their veins. Now I think that I found the poem in question. It's this one, Dyma Farwnad Mr. Roland Morgan of Machen, a funeral ode to Mr. Roland Morgan of Machen. It's got an introduction, not sure if this was by David Benwyn himself, but provides details of Roland Morgan's ancestry. I'll just read this in English for brevity, and because the language isn't contentious. This is the funeral ode of Mr. Roland Morgan of Machen, son and heir of Mr. Thomas of Machen, son of Sir John Morgan, son of Ivan, son of Llywelyn, son of Ifor, son of Cledri, and then back to Meirig, king of Dyfed, and one of the 4 kings that carried 4 golden swords in front of Arthur at the great feast in Caerleon on Usk. Okay, so we get a mention of Arthur even before the poem has properly started. Not explicitly in the genealogy of the Morgans, mind, but one of their supposed ancestors, Meirig of Dyfed, is named as carrying a sword in front of Arthur. Those familiar with Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae will recognise this narrative. It alludes to the events of Arthur's coronation in Caerleon in that source. This Meirig of Dyfed is not considered historical. My personal belief is that this Meirig was probably based on Meirig of South East Wales. That's the father of Athrwys. But Geoffrey had a different father for Arthur in his version. Bear in mind, of course, that Geoffrey of Monmouth seems to have greatly adapted and embellished any source material that he used. But just to be clear, the introduction doesn't explicitly place Arthur in the genealogy of the Morgans. Instead, it is this Meirig of Dyfed that is said to be their ancestor. And it mentions the crowning of Arthur in Caerleon. Their ancestors were lords of Caerleon, and it's fair to say that they did believe that Arthur operating there was historical. So this funeral ode is dedicated to Roland Morgan of the noble Morgan family. So what do we know of him? He was a figure that lived in the 16th century, born in 1517 and died in 1577. And he was the issue of Thomas Morgan, and Thomas Morgan was the second son of Sir John Morgan. Both his father and grandfather were close to Henry VII, as I described earlier. It hasn't got loads about him in Appleton Morgan's book, but it does say that he was of Machen, presumably Plas Machen. Could it be just a coincidence then that the Morgans are linked so strongly with Machen, while the Arthur reference also calls Arthur Machen? Or could there be some sort of misunderstanding here? There's mention of Roland's wife and offspring, including 2 sons, Thomas and Henry, and 4 daughters, including Catherine, who married someone called Miles Morgan. It also says that he was sheriff in 1557. Fletcher's notes reference the interesting situation with the family inheritance. It seems that Roland had been disinherited from his cousin, William Morgan's estates, in favour of another branch of the family. But Roland's branch of the family did end up regaining the estate through his son, Thomas Morgan, according to J. Kerr Fletcher. But fate quite upset all William Morgan's calculations, for Miles Morgan married Roland's daughter, Elizabeth, and the Herberts being extinct in the male line, Miles bequeathed the Tredegar estates to his brother-in-law Thomas Morgan of Machen, Roland Morgan's eldest son. So Roland Morgan's branch of the family lost and regained the best of the Morgan's estates via Roland's son, Thomas Morgan. Okay, so the thing to keep in mind is that the subject of this poem is a Tudor-era member of the Morgan family who had recently passed away, and who had lived at Machen and was of noble standing, who traced his lineage back to the royal and noble houses of South East and South West Wales from the late medieval period. Okay, so now we arrive at the text itself. There's no English translation, so I will do a sort of commentary on it. I'm not a recognised authority on this sort of poetry, but I think that most of it is easy enough to understand, so let me talk you through it. The first few verses just clearly reference mourning for Roland. It calls him the second Cynan, so Cynan is one of the greatest Welsh heroes and a messianic type figure, so Roland is figuratively Cynan here. From an ancestral point of view, he's mentioned as the grandson of Sir John, the influential Sir John Morgan, as previously discussed. Roland is then called the best of his noble lines of South East Wales, Matthews, Flemings, etc. Iestyn here probably means Iestyn ap Gwrgant, the last king of Glamorgan, as previously mentioned. Master of the land from Caradog. Not sure which Caradog is meant. Could be a figure from the later Middle Ages, like Caradog ap Griffith, or even an early medieval figure like Caradog Vreicfras, or even the historical Caractacus, who led the Roman-era tribe of the area in battle, the Silures. Lots of Caradogs connected with this area. This Meirig Goch who's mentioned here is probably the Meirig Goch who is said to be Lord of Caio in the 12th century. There's more explicit references then to late medieval figures such as Meredydd Gethin, Lord of Gwynllwg, credited with building Machen Castle in stone, also known as Castell Meredydd. There's an interesting reconstructed image of what the castle would have looked like in the 12th and 13th century. It's almost completely gone now. These are the images off Coveline, but this is another native lord based in Machen from the late medieval period and also connected with the Morgans. And Hywel of Caerleon was probably Hywel ap Iorwerth, a powerful native lord in the late 12th century. In 1173 captured Caerleon Castle from the Norman lord Richard de Clare, also known as Richard Strongbow. These de Clares are named a bit later on too. They were the second Anglo-Norman lords of Glamorgan, replacing the Fitzroberts. Hywel ap Iorwerth also burnt down Abergavenny Castle, owned by William de Barros, in retaliation for an Anglo-Norman massacre in the area. Hywel was a ruthless guy who had blinded and castrated his own uncle for his inheritance. He actually went on to make peace with the English and defended their territory from native Welsh attacks. There's an obvious mention of his heraldry too. Tri chastell gwechim I good mewn cochel. But it then says all his descendants had the griffin in gold, an allusion to the Morgan heraldic emblem. Okay, I know I haven't gone over it in detail, but the thrust of the poem so far has been to mourn Roland, to say how great he was, to name members of his illustrious ancestry, to highlight his noble pedigree, and to say that he was even greater than these. There's definitely no mention of Arthur so far, and no even subtle allusions to him either, other than what was in the introduction. But let's have a really close look now at the next few verses, because this is where the Arthur Machen reference is actually made. Gŵr o iawn birwaid gorau un barwn, gorau oedd ar goedd Mr. Roland Gwyddau, gorwch llu bi, ni roi'r bin neb. It means something like a man of good pure blood, the best. The greatest man was Mr. Roland, did you know? Above the rest. He wouldn't give his pen despite anyone. Gŵr dewr fi wyneb, gwyr Duw a dynion. A brave man without ego, a man of God and men. The next verse is at the crux of this all. Ach Clay, I lawr, ar holl dau mawrion. Ach Clay means the pedigree or house of Clay. I lawr, ar holl dau mawrion, that means they came down on all the noble houses. This refers to the powerful de Clay family, who were the lords of Glamorgan between 1217 and 1337. Remember that these Norman lords had taken territory from the Morgans' Welsh ancestors, and it is this that is what's referenced in the next lines. O'i farwdd o'i airwal chafrau ddewrion. From its death came the golden hawks that were exceedingly brave. The death of the Clay line is what's referenced, remember, that was the subject of the previous line. Airwalch could also be meant as a battle hawk. Gwalch is commonly used figuratively for warriors. This word afrai, I'm not sure how to interpret it because it isn't in the dictionary. It could be something that was defective in the manuscript or a word that I'm just not familiar with. The closest word that I'm aware of is avraid with a D on the end, unnecessary or exceedingly, which is what I've tentatively suggested. But when I've discussed this with other people, they've suggested a few other options. Could be a contraction of avoriai, was struck, which would give a meaning that the golden hawks struck the brave. But you could also conceivably say that it was the golden hawks that struck the mighty. Someone else has suggested me that it could be arvai, arms, referring to a coat of arms. The golden hawks were the arms of the brave. Another plausible possibility. But I think the subject here is still Roland Morgan, and the meaning is that from the demise of the Clay dynasty came a new dynasty, i.e. the Morgans. But it's not clear, and could also be referring to specific ancestors of Roland that fought the Clays without naming them. We've talked about a few already, but some other plausible candidates would be someone like Iorwerth ap Owain. It's the father of Hywel ap Iorwerth. He actually killed Richard de Clay and lived at Machen Castle, aka Castell Meredydd. So that would be a really close match with what's said. There's also Morgan ap Meredydd, Morgan the Rebel. He could be another one then. He led a famous rebellion against the Normans, and the Norman lords of Glamorgan at the time were the de Clays. Okay, but whoever this figure is, it's someone that postdates the de Clay family, because at the start of the verse it specifically says that this figure comes from the death of the de Clay line. Okay, so next it says Osog tir yma a'i seigiau trymion a gleddau di wall a'i ligas wallon. That means something like the goshawk of this land with his great feasts and faultless banquets, second to Caswallon. That's the historical Castellananas. Goshawk is a figurative term for a warrior again, second only to Castellanus, the historical Brythonic leader of the Britons in their resistance to Julius Caesar, one of the true heroes of the Britons. So David Benwin brings up these great heroes in terms of eulogistic comparison. And here's another one, possibly the best known. The crucial words that have inspired this video. Arthur Machen, bir ich bonerunis. That means the Arthur of Machen, faithful hindmost ox of the island. So this is a metaphorical use of the name Arthur, meaning that the subject of this verse was a great warrior like Arthur, and based in Machen. The word Arthur then is used totally figuratively here, just to mean something like a great warrior and leader. So we can't draw the conclusion that the poet was telling us that the historical Arthur was also based at Machen, and used the name of this village as a cognomen. It's a bit like in another one of David Benwin's poems. He refers to Edmund Morgan as Gwalchmai Gwent. That's the Gwalchmai of Gwent. The last line of this verse then is Aethyn Eirgris, Aethyn Argron. He went in his death shirt, went to the earth. This is the elegy for Roland Morgan, so I think that the subject of all of this is Roland Morgan, and it's him that's Arthur Machen, although it could less obviously be referring to a member of his lineage that fought more directly against the de Clays. Okay, so what I'll say is there's obviously a heavy use of figurative language here. A lot of this could have been interpreted differently if you had someone else translating it, but not really in a way that would support what Wilson and Blackett have suggested. Let's be clear, this isn't a source that tells us that the historical Arthur had this name Arthur Machen, but they were right in the sense that this source tells us a lot about the history of South East Wales. I hope you've enjoyed the journey, even if you've been disappointed with the result. I'll be doing a lot more videos very soon.